Okay, hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Philippa Portnoy, and I'm a member of the Programming Committee of the Columbia Club of New York. And I want to give a big shout out to Catherine Hofstetter tonight, one of our programming chairs, who helped to organize this evening's event. As a Barnard alum and a lifelong New Yorker, I'm really excited about tonight. We have a fascinating program for you with Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Barnard, Dr. Nan Rothschild, as well as Jessica MacLean, one of her co-authors, as they discuss Buried Beneath the City, an archaeological history of New York, winner of this year's Popular Book Award for the Society of American Archaeology. I am pleased to introduce our two speakers tonight, Dr. Nan Rothschild and Jessica MacLean. Dr. Rothschild is a historical archaeologist who works in two distinct regions, New York City and the American Southwest. She has also worked with museum collections. The Landmarks Preservation Commission Research Center is named in her honor. Jessica MacLean is an urban archaeologist at New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission and the New York City Archaeological Repository. The LPC is the largest municipal preservation agency in the United States. It is responsible for protecting New York City's architecturally, historically, and culturally significant buildings and sites. Jessica received her MA in Museum Anthropology from Columbia. Now I'm pleased to hand the program over to our speakers. Feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A or the chat, and we will get to them at the end. And thank you so much for your time tonight.
So thank you. This evening, we are going to share highlights from our book, as Philippa mentioned. We'll get, if you could please go back. There we are. All right. So as Philippa indicated, we are here tonight to share with you highlights from our recently published book, Buried Beneath the City, which is an archaeological history of New York. And tonight, as well as in the book, we will provide an introduction about who we are, what urban archaeology is, how it's usually done in New York City, and what it can tell us of people about the people who once lived there. Next slide, please. The book highlights stories from the New York City Archaeological Repository, which was created in 2014 by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Its mission is to curate the city's significant archaeological collections and to make them accessible by appointment to scholars and university classes, as shown here, and to everyone through our website. The URL for our website is indicated here, newyorkcity.gov/archaeology, where we highlight artifacts from the collection, as well as other educational, we have exhibits and other kinds of interpretive information. Next slide, please. Archaeology has happened in what is now New York City since the 19th century. However, while many archaeologists lived in New York City in the late 19th and early 20th century, most of them focused their interests on other parts of the world, such as Egypt or Central and South America. So the work that happened in the city was generally done by advocational archaeologists, including Stanley Wisniewski, who's pictured here, excavating at the Graham Court site in Queens. These advocational archaeologists largely focused on documenting Indigenous peoples' histories and sites, as well as areas related to the Revolutionary War. This work was essential, as many of these sites were subsequently lost to development. It would be completely unknown without their efforts. However, it should be known that they did not employ methodologies or ethics that today's professionals would use. Next slide, please. So what is urban archaeology? Urban archaeology is the study of cities using the things, the material culture and artifacts that have been left behind. It's the study of the city and not just archaeology in the city. Pictured here, you see archaeologists standing on what was a late 18th century sloop that was found at the World Trade Center site in 2010. The ship was used to create landfill and expand the western side of the city. And after its discovery in 2010, was removed by the archaeological team. It's presently being conserved and will be exhibited at the New York State Museum. Next slide, please. The archaeology covered in the book derives from 40 years of field work done by many professional archaeologists in the city. The first and most common way archaeology happened is through what's known as the environmental review process. There are federal, state, and local laws that ensure that government agencies consider the potential impacts of imposed projects on a range of environmental issues, including archaeology. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. If you could go back one more, I have one more point to make. Thank you. I should speak to this particular slide. This image here is of the 7 Hanover Square block excavation, which is illustrated here in the foreground. And in the back right is the Stadhuis block excavation. And both of these projects are seminal projects in New York City that demonstrate that significant archaeological resources are present even in the densely developed parts of New York City, like Lower Manhattan, pictured here. The Stadhuis block excavations targeted the area where the Dutch colonial town hall was located. And the 7 Hanover Square was where the waterfront was expanded through the process of making land. Both projects uncovered significant colonial artifacts, right? Those are the objects used by people in day-to-day activities that are now curated in the repository, and a few of which will be mentioned here tonight. Next slide, please. Artifacts or material culture are essential to understanding what happened in the past, as documents are. Archaeologists in New York City typically draw upon a range of documents, including maps, census records, business directories, and probate inventories, to determine the evolution of what has happened at a particular site. Written history emerged in New York after Europeans arrived. Before that, archaeology and what's known as oral history provides valuable information about past lives. Archaeology is thus a key source of information about the long period of time that Indigenous peoples lived in the region before Europeans arrived. Next slide, please. Archaeology has helped to trace the lifeways of Indigenous peoples that lived in the region for thousands of years. This slide shows some of the Indigenous artifacts curated at the New York City Archaeological Repository. They include stone tools from different time periods of use, and these particular ones were used for hunting and processing food. In the upper right-hand corner, you see ceramics that were used for food storage and cooking. These particular artifacts were found in the Bronx, Queens, and in Staten Island. Ceramic vessels first appear in New York City 3,000 years ago, and over time, the decorations on the vessels, like these seen here on the top right, become more elaborate. Archaeologists believe that these designs serve several purposes. The first is to set makers apart from one another. Secondly, for aesthetics. And third, to signify cultural affiliation or cultural relationships between makers and users. Archaeologists also believe that the potters were both men and women, but it is women who pass down clan markings on pottery from generation to generation. It's important to note also that Indigenous people still live in New York City. Some are descended from the people who were here when European colonists arrived, while others have come from across the Americas. The descendants of the original Munsee Lenape live among the Delaware Nation, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, and the Stockbridge Munsee Community Band of Mohicans, all of which are recognized by the US federal government as being tribal nations descended from the people who once lived in what is now New York City, in addition to the Shinnecock Nation. New York State has also recognized these tribes, as well as the Unchuk Nation on Long Island. Next, thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Historical archaeology in North America is defined as the period after which Europeans arrived and started writing down, which is what we mean by history, writing down information. In New York City, the period of historical archaeology ends at the end of the 19th century. The practice uses multiple threads information, including this map, which is the Costello plan from 1660, and it shows you the concentration of the early Dutch settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan. The red arrow on the right marks what is now Wall Street. At that time, it was a wooden palisade thought to be able to defend the Dutch from indigenous peoples and from the British. The arrow on the lower left points to a canal. The Dutch liked canals, and but it was filled in and is now Broad Street. Next slide. Thank you. So when the Dutch, one back. Thank you. 17th century hearth and home. The Dutch brought with them their material culture, and in particular, they brought things that made them recognize the houses they were living in as related to their home. So on the left, you see 3 artifacts that were used in construction. The pan tile or roofing tile on the top was made of red clay. The yellow brick on the lower left, and the green glazed floor tile was on the right. And on the right side of the slide is a tin glazed slide that was used in the home. And it was used partly to, this is a scene from the Old Testament. So these tiles were placed around the fireplace and along the floorboards, and they were also used to educate the young in terms of religious piety. Next slide, please. Well, the next slide is also about 17th century Dutch material culture. And here you see 2 forms that you might see in Dutch genre paintings of the time. The one on the left is a cookpot. Cookpots were redware vessels that came in many sizes, they were set directly on the coals and used to warm or cook the food, and then they were brought to the table to serve the food. This particular piece has no charring on it, so we think it was probably broken before it was used. The vessel on the right is an earthenware jug. It comes from the Lovelace Tavern on the Stadthaus block. It was probably used to pour wine and ale. When we found these pieces originally, we thought they had been made in the Netherlands, but later research indicated that they had been made in the New World, just following Dutch forms. And so this is one of the reasons why a repository is particularly important, because as new research techniques emerge, you can update the information that you have about the objects. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. When the British took over from the Dutch in New York, a surprising number of things materially did not change, but we do find some innovations. We find British ceramics being used, and here are 2 particularly British artifacts. The one on the right is a headstone for Mary Dalziel, who lived in the 18th century and was buried in Trinity Church. What's interesting about this headstone is that it only has her husband's name. And if she had been a Dutch woman, it would have had her birth name as well. On the left, you see one of the very rare artifacts that is able to be linked to a particular individual. This was part of a seal, a wine bottle seal, for Governor Benjamin Fletcher. It has his coat of arms on it. He was governor in the 1690s, but he was recalled to Britain for consorting with pirates. Next slide, please. By the 18th century, The city had become an English colony and part of the global commercial Atlantic world. And on the left, you see a terracotta sugar mold that was found in Whitehall Street in Lower Manhattan. Its recovery led archaeologists to research New York City's role in the sugar trade. I had no idea of New York's prominence in that trade, but at the beginning of the American Revolution, there were 5 sugar refineries in Lower Manhattan, and by 1840, there were something like 14, and they produced half of the sugar that was consumed in the United States. The sugar was grown in the Caribbean by enslaved people and then brought to New York. It was boiled and cooled in these molds, and then some white clay slip was poured in to the mold to whiten and purify the sugar. The molasses was a byproduct that came out of the cooling process, and that was also sold separately. The artifact on the right, or the group of artifacts on the right, is from a punch bowl that was used to serve drinks that had rum and brandy and sugar and sometimes citrus drinks into the colonial and early 19th century. May I have the next slide, please? Archaeology is absolutely essential for documenting the lives of some people, such as African Americans, who are really ignored in the documentary record. The excavation of the African burial ground, and the red arrow shows you its location, was done in the early 90s. It yielded more than 400 sets of human remains that were analyzed to reveal some of the physical stresses that early Blacks underwent in New York City, and the harsh conditions of children born in New York City, many of whom did not survive infancy. Some of the adults were subject to DNA analysis, which revealed African origins. On the left, the artifacts are shroud pins. Burials were wrapped in shrouds, which were then pinned and usually placed into single wooden coffins. Shroud pins were the most common burial-related artifact at the African burial ground. The sites are within the African Burial Ground and Commons Historic District, and the Landmarks Commission regulates any ground disturbing work in that area. The next slide, please. In the 18th century, archaeology is very helpful in illuminating everyday items and practices that are lost to history. The objects on the left, the triangular crucibles, were used for melting sugar. They were found in the workshop of Simeon Sumain, who lived for a time at 7 Hanover Square. The silver tea caddies and the sugar box on the right were made in his workshop around 1720, and they're currently in the collection of the Met Museum. Now, obviously, it's unlikely to find objects like those silver tea caddies in the archaeological record. They would be too valuable to throw away, so they would be sold or passed on. But the crucibles are really useful in documenting the artisanal processes. The discovery of Sumain's workshop led to some additional documentary research. The family was part of the Protestant Huguenot diaspora, people who were expelled from Catholic France in 1680 to 1690. The Sumains came in 1685, and he opened his workshop in about 1709. Sumain was an enslaver, and he likely trained Tom, who was his principal man, as a silversmith as well. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Nan. Unlike the work of Sumain, who's well known to us because of his legacy that exists in museum collections, other forms of manufacturing were much more anonymous. So what we have here are, on the left of your screen, are the remnants of button making and button manufacturing. Well, on the right side of your screen, you can see a completed bone button. These buttons and button manufacturing were conducted by individuals who are living at the New York City Almshouse, which is located where New York City Hall stands today in Lower Manhattan. It was in operation between 1735 and 1797. And it was for people who were deemed unable to care for themselves. But in return for housing and food, they were expected to assist with various industries, such as this button making industries here. And this is one of the ways that Archaeologist allows us to get glimpses and understand the lives of individuals, such as those residing at the almshouse, who would be otherwise invisible to written histories. Next slide, please. Archaeology can also illuminate different moments in New York City's history. For example, New York has had a long and important military history. If you can see in the image on the left, what we have here is the 1755 Ratzer Plan. And overlaid on this map, on the 1755 map, you can see the yellow outline of what is the extension of the one train, right? The subway that runs down the west side of Manhattan. And if you can see the red elements, the subway happened to overlay the outline of the battery fortifications, which date to this mid-18th century period. The archaeology exposed these walls of these fortifications and help us to understand the layout of 18th century New York in relation to the contemporary footprint of things. On the right side, we have physical traces of that particular battle of the Revolutionary War. On the left, we have a USA button, which is of an enlisted individual, right? These are the Americans or the Patriots. And on the right, we have a member, a British soldier of the 31st Regiment of Foot. And that particular regiment saw action at Fort Ticonderoga and Saratoga. The revolution shattered New York City and turned it into a battlefield. Fires destroyed more than a third of the city, and the British occupied it for most of the war. However, this did provide an opportunity for enslaved people to escape, and many took refuge while the British controlled the city. Historian Paul Gilgee considers this period the largest slave revolt of the 18th century, and estimates between 80 and 100,000 enslaved people escaped the 13 colonies because the British granted freedom to enslaved individuals who came over to the side of the British forces. Next slide, please. Evacuation Day was November 25th, 1783, and it marked the date when the British left the city. And it was an annual holiday in New York for many years after. New York played an important role in the development of the United States. It was there that the Congress of the Confederation met in 1785, and there where George Washington was sworn in as the first president in 1789. It was also there that the nation's banking system, of which New York is an important financial center to this day. You could go back one slide. Yes, what we have here, oh, nope, sorry, the ceramics, yes. What we have here on the left is a tankard with that's depicting George Washington astride his horse. And on the right, we have a plate with the figure of Columbia. Now, Columbia was an important figure in the nascent republic, right? That these particular ceramics were manufactured, ironically, in Europe. These are Staffordshire ceramics that, even though the Revolutionary War was lost, the ceramic manufacturers saw an opportunity to market to the burgeoning republic, and the ceramics that they thus imported to New York City carried the symbols of the newfound nation. So Columbia on the right is a popular figure of freedom. The headstone that you can see in the back, the pyramidal structure, is also George Washington's headstone, as well as this mug that you can imagine being used in the taverns in Lower Manhattan that is celebrating his victory. These are, nope, yep, that's great. Next slide, please. So what you see here are more ceramics. These are painted pearlware bowls and saucers. And these particular ceramics come from a deposit that had over 35,000 broken ceramic vessels. And these were found in the rear yard of the 7 Hanover Square site. And documentary records indicate that there were 2 ceramic dealers, wholesale dealers, that imported ceramics to Lower Manhattan. And by looking closely at these particular ceramics, you can see that there is an absence of useware. There's no evidence of spoons or knives being used on these particular vessels, which suggests to us that the ceramics broke in transit and were thus disposed of, or just thus thrown away, which is one of the questions that we ask as archaeologists, is how do things get entered in the archaeological record? So in this case, we believe that it was new ceramics that broke and were then discarded. And we can then imagine what sort of a considerable financial loss to the particular merchant who purchased these wares and then were unable to sell them because of them being broken in transit. Next slide, please. Ceramics are valuable to archaeology because they are abundantly used and were abundantly used. They're easily broken, and they also can survive in the ground for hundreds of years. They're important time markers because their styles tend to change quickly over time. So that allows us to date archaeological deposits by the types of ceramics that we find in them. In 19th century New York, it considered, continued to be a production center, and the extent continued with time. On the left here, you can see a stoneware pot that was manufactured in Manhattan Wells, which is located near today's Foley Square, which is behind the City Hall building. And it was manufactured sometime between 1791 and 1830. And this particular vessel was made by John Remy III, who came from a family of German potters who arrived in New York, along with the Crolius family, who brought German methodologies, essentially the German knowledge of making stonewares, to New York City. So you can see on the right, we have a price list of Clarkson Crolius, who was the 3rd generation Crolius making stonewares, which gives us a really good indication of the different types of vessels that were popular in the 1830s, the 1820s. Stonewares were particularly valuable in local economies because they were essential for food storage, right? They're helpful for storing food at a time before refrigeration, where preservation through fermenting food was common practice. And you can sort of consider these stonewares to be the Tupperware storage of the 19th century. And they would store everything from pickles to dry goods like flour. Next slide, please. Now, here's another example of a stoneware jar that was made in Lower Manhattan. And this particular vessel was made by free Black potter Thomas Kamara between 1793 and 1819, and was found by archaeologists excavating in Fulton Street. So I don't know if you can see, just to the right of the handle on the left is Kamara's signature, and that's the tri-lobed tassel that is attached to the swag. So if you kind of think of the fabric at the top of draperies, you have this swag motif. And we have vessels that are stamped with Thomas Kamara and have this tri-lobed motif, which is the way that we can identify vessels of Kamara when we don't have his name stamped on their side. Now, Kamara was born enslaved by the second generation of the William Crolius family, right, whose price list we just saw. But Thomas Kamara was manumitted with his parents and siblings in 1778. It is thought that that Kamara was trained in the Crolius pottery, and shortly after his manumission, he established a pottery of his own in Corlear's Hook, which is the Lower East Side of Manhattan today. Now, Kamara's identity as a free Black man, we understand through the 1800 and 1810 New York census, which is illustrated on the right. And if you can see the arrows towards the bottom of the image, and I acknowledge that the image is not particularly large, but after Thomas Kamara's name is written Black. And he is given that designation rather than being identified as an enslaved African, because in these two censuses, there were no columns to identify free Blacks, only enslaved Blacks. So it is through going to through the documentary record that we're able to make the connection between Kamara's identity as a free Black man who was living and working in the Lower East Side. We know from additional research that he left New York City in 1820 and went to Sierra Leone as a founding leader of a settlement that was sponsored by the American Colonization Society. Kamara's direct descendants reside today in Florida. Next slide, please. In the 1800 and 1810 census records, we also came to understand that Kamara belonged to a network of free Blacks who resided in the Lower East Side, who were connected through business, church, and family. And one of Kamara's neighbors in the 7th Ward in Lower Manhattan was Daniel Johnson, who himself was a free Black man and an oysterman by trade, who sold fresh and pickled oysters that were packaged in stoneware oyster jars, like these two that are illustrated here. And they look kind of like they come somewhere in between a canning jar and a paint can. Now, these oyster jars were found in the same deposit as the Kamara sherd previously illustrated. And these particular kind of jars were manufactured locally in New York City and were used to pickle New York oysters that were then shipped to places like Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina. They were shipped down to the Caribbean, and they have been found in South America, in Guyana and Suriname. So once the pickled oysters were packaged in the jars, the tops were sealed with cork, and there is a well where hot wax would have been poured into the top, in essence, preserving the contents. So the vinegars and the salt that went into the oysters helped preserve it, in addition to these stoneware jars. To date, these are the only two stoneware jars that have been found in an archaeological context. And these particular jars were not identified or understood to be oyster jars until they came into the repository, and additional research helped elucidate the fact that they are in fact oyster jars. So like Nan previously mentioned, this is another instance where having the ability to go back and look at artifacts with new knowledge allows us to understand new information than we previously had. The next slide, please. And Nan, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you. So faunal analysis or animal remains provides another kind of historical text that can tell us a great deal about past foodways and local environment. These large oyster shells, and you probably can't see the scale, but they are quite large. They dated to the 18th century, and they lived between 20 and 30 years. Oysters produce a growth break every year, so you can count those breaks in the way that you count tree rings. But they tell you the age of the creature at death. Studying oyster shells provides important information about the environment of New York City's water, when it became polluted, when it was cleared up. But oysters themselves were a very important food source in the colonial era. They were very plentiful and cheap, and everybody ate them. And Charles Dickens writes about them in his 1840 visit to America. So we know that they were really central to the diet. Next slide, please. And here you have a cow, butchered cow. The edge on the left is sawn. On the right, you see that the epiphysis has not fused. And so we think this is a young animal, and we suspect that it's a male because the females were preserved to produce more young and for milk production. The study of animal bones is also very important because it tells us what people were eating, how they prepared their food, and it also gives us some indication about the environment. Next slide, please. Sometimes an archaeological find leads to additional documentary research, as we have mentioned a couple of times in this talk. After recovering this organic material on the right, which was preserved by having been burnt, a researcher found this advertisement on the left. On the lower left, it's placed by George Gannett on December 1st, 1835, and he says, there are 10,000 gunny bags for sale in his shop at 52 Water Street. 15 days later, Gannett's stock of burlap bags went up in flames, a casualty of the Great Fire of 1835. And following the Great Fire, Gannett and his family moved to St. Louis. Next slide, please. Personal details of individuals are rarely connected to objects, as we noted with the Fletcher coat of arms, which was the only one. We have no idea who used and lost this 19th century short-stemmed Turkish pipe. The pipe is marked Kazar, which is in southeastern Slovakia, where it was made sometime before 1850. The pipe was excavated from a builder's trench at the Stadthaus block in Lower Manhattan, and the fact that it's not broken suggests that it was lost rather than discarded, perhaps by an immigrant laborer from Eastern Europe working in the construction business. Next slide, please. These are 19th century medicine bottles. I'm sure many of you have seen bottles like this. These were found at the Van Cortlandt House in the Bronx and are indicative of the family's attempt to treat themselves from various illnesses. The bottle on the left is Osgood's India Cholagog, and it was marketed to purify the blood and to treat those who were suffering from bilious diseases such as fevers and headaches. The one in the middle is Dr. O'Toole's cough remedy, which was supposed to cure a wide range of illnesses, including tuberculosis, for which there was no cure at the time. And the one on the right was Ayer's cherry pectoral cough medicine, and it was marketed for coughs, croup, asthma, sore throats. It initially contained morphine, heroin, and alcohol. Next slide. So you might not get better, but you might not feel so bad. Next slide. One particularly important story that archaeology has now helped to tell in New York City concerns Seneca Village, a community settled by Black people in 1825 at a time when some Blacks in New York State were still enslaved. The village was located about 3 miles north of the settled area of Manhattan, and it was destroyed to build Central Park in 1858. Newspaper accounts from the mid-19th century depicted Seneca Village as a shanty town, and said that the people in it, were squatters and were not really people who deserved to be living in any important place. But the historical and archaeological research that has been done there shows that interpretation was really wrong. And this was a strong community of people who, many of whom owned their own homes, who valued education and placed the church or the churches at the center of their lives. This image shows the excavations, which were completed in 2011. And on the right, you can see the location of the excavation. It was in the backyard of two houses owned by the Webster and Phillips. That's 19th century map. Next slide, please. And this transfer printed, and I think quite lovely, Gothic teapot, reconstructed from many different pieces, as you can see, was excavated in about the same location. It was between the Websters and Phillips yards. Tea was an important ritual in 19th century women's lives across racial and class divides in the city. All 225 or so residents of Seneca Village, including Blacks, Irish, few Germans, were evicted by eminent domain in 1858 so that Central Park could be built. As many as 3 generations who offered significant stability were disrupted. The community was disbanded and scattered. However, we have recovered a lot of information about Seneca Village, and we have found 2 descendants from the community. So we're very pleased with that. And this concludes our presentation. We thank you very much for your time and your attention. And we hope that we stimulated your interest, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing discussion. So we do have some questions. One of the questions is, when you mentioned some of the slaves who escaped with the British, where did they go to?
That's an excellent question. Nan, do you want to answer that, or would you like me to?
Understanding is that many of them went to Canada as the British left. Once the British had lost, they couldn't stay, and so they went north to Canada. Do you have more information than that, Jessica?
No, that is what I was going to say, and that recently the roles of enslaved individuals who were manumitted by the British, who did relocate to Ontario and the Maritime provinces, have been digitized, and this information is online. So if you were to do a Google search for British slaves manumitted following the Revolution, you will find more information about this particular question. Yeah.
So thank you. So another question we have here is, can the USA button really be traced to the Revolutionary War, since the United States of America did not truly exist in name at that time? The continental states were a confederation. They want to know what your comment is on that.
I don't have a comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And the research that was done by the archaeologists essentially consulted textile and fashion experts. And I do understand the fact that we were not the United States of America at that time. And my understanding is that these were some early expressions of what came to be used by later regiments as buttons, but that the time period of these particular USA buttons have been tied to the Revolutionary period.
Thank you. Another question, can you talk a little bit more about the Fulton Street project, and when was that conducted?
Yes, the Fulton, oh, sorry, Nan, please.
I was going to say I didn't work on that project, so.
Yes, the Fulton Street project has been conducted actually in the last 10 years. So it is a fairly recent project. And it followed the replacement of the water mains in Lower Manhattan. And so as the water mains were replaced, there were archaeologists who were involved in those construction projects monitoring the excavations as they were happening. And so in particular instances where when the asphalt was removed, archaeologists would go in first and could identify any traces of earlier foundations or deposits. So for example, the excavation that unearthed the Camara vessel along with the oyster jars was a basement deposit in a house that was then on Pearl Street. And Fulton Street was cut through in 1815. And when Fulton Street was cut through, this house on Pearl Street was taken through eminent domain and was demolished. And so in essence, this deposit that we found were things that were put in the basement basically as the building was coming down. And that particular house was a boarding house run by a widow woman who let rooms and also cooked for them. And so the remains in that deposit related to the day-to-day lives of that particular boarding house.
Okay, thank you. You know, someone here put a comment in about the button and they said, that was definitely a Revolutionary War uniform button, and it looks quite similar to some of the coins minted before the Constitution.
Oh,
Thank you.
that's great.
Okay, some of this may have been answered already, but let me make sure. The battered fortification uncovered during the expansion of the Battery subway dates to what period? What is the status of fortifications removed?
That's an excellent question. So the battery wall that was illustrated in the Ratzer map, construction was begun, I believe, in the 1720s and continued through the 1730s. And so as sections of that fortification were left in place on either side of the subway cut, the section of the wall that was removed for the construction was actually recreated in the Battery subway station.
So you can see it, right?
Yes.
You can go down and see it.
Yes. So yes, if you go to that station, it is there today. And then part of that process is extensive documentation. So the walls and their relationship to the Battery were photographed and drawn, and then each stone was numbered as it was removed so it could be re-articulated for the display. But we also have a record of how the wall was put together as we were taking it apart.
Thank you. So Columbia University had 2 or 3 campuses during this time period. Have there been any archaeological finds?
I don't believe there's been any. I mean, you have to understand that archaeology is done if environmental review is triggered. And I don't believe that there has been any environmental review of the 2 early Columbia locations that I know about. So the answer would be no.
All right. Is there any evidence of the Dutch purchase of Manhattan from the Native Americans?
No. Well, I mean, there are Dutch documents. There's no Native American document that is corresponding to what the Dutch said.
That's great. Fascinating questions.
If I could follow up a little bit, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind with that particular transaction is that the Indigenous, the Native Americans who are living in New York had a very different concept of land ownerships than the Europeans did. And so it is that transaction, Indigenous peoples didn't believe in land ownership, that no one could own land. And so sort of the sense was that they were giving permission for the Europeans to hunt, to access, and to use that land, whereas the Europeans saw it as a formal land transfer within the system of European governance. And so you had basically a sort of a conflict of worldviews that was happening in that moment. So whether you want to call that a profound cultural misunderstanding, there was two sides to that particular narrative. I don't know, Nan, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's a very good point, Jessica. I was going to say something like that, but I think it represents 2 different perspectives on what the transfer meant. the possible loaning of the land for use versus the actual sale, physical sale of the land.
That makes sense. Is your work ever used as the basis for reparation discussions?
I don't know of any examples where it has been. Do you, Jess?
I don't, and I do not know, and I'm not sure. I think I do not know if particular conversations about reparations have begun to take place in New York City per se.
I think that if we were talking about a basis for reparations, there would be much more available in the documentary record than in the archaeological record per se, that would serve as information and a basis for claims.
Okay, thank you. How far north was New York City settled in the historical archaeological period? Were there distinct spatial breakpoints or dividing lines in the phases of the city's growth?
No, I don't think so. I think the city grew very gradually northward. I mean, as I mentioned, when Seneca Village was occupied in 1825, it was 3 miles north of the settled area of Manhattan, which at that point was really at about 14th Street. But then gradually, people moved north. I mean, it's interesting to me to think about the process of landfilling. Landfilling is a very expensive procedure, and in order that people felt that they had to make land, enlarge the boundaries of Lower Manhattan rather than simply move north, is a very interesting comment on, I guess, their sense of safety at the time.
I think I would also add to that we have been very Manhattan-centric in our focus here today, and that's in part because of some of the bias that we have in the collections we have in the repository, that they represent collections that are either belong to sister agencies or were excavated in Lower Manhattan. So what we have in the repository doesn't reflect the entire history of New York City. And one of the things in terms of understanding New York at different points in the colonial era is it's important to differentiate whether you're talking about Brooklyn, whether you're talking about Queens or Manhattan or Staten Island. And that when we talk about New York City in our book in the early colonial period, that it is focused on Lower Manhattan, and that there are archaeological sites in other boroughs that we don't necessarily have in our particular collections, but that Brooklyn and Queens were rural in the early colonial period. They were farm centers of farm production. And were the areas that supported what we would call urban or the densely settled parts of Lower Manhattan. There are also sort of village structures where you have the village of Bushwick and other villages in Queens and Brooklyn that also developed dense cores. So one of the fascinating things about New York City is how varied it is because of the geographic scale within the 5 boroughs today.
Thank you. Okay, so here's another question. Following on the answer regarding the Fulton Street project, does the city work with archaeologists when excavation work begins? Sounds like a collaboration. Can you elaborate?
Jessica, you can handle that.
Yes, it is a collaboration. In the example of environmental review that both Nan and I spoke to, when archaeological projects come under different regulations, the city mandates the archaeology, and we work with the archaeologists who do the actual excavations. And so there is a process in place where a site is initially evaluated for archaeological sensitivity, and that's a review of the historical record and an understanding of that particular location through time. And if it's deemed to be sensitive, then the process moves forward with testing. And if the site is determined to have intact archaeological deposits, then the next step is excavation. And so the work we do at the Landmarks Preservation Commission as the Department of Archaeology is collaborating with archaeologists throughout that excavation process. And then at the repository, after the excavation is complete, in terms of housing the particular collections and making them available to the general public. So yes, it is a collaboration in that regard. However, it's a collaboration that we mandate. So.
Thank you. Most of your examples are ceramics. Besides the buttons, how many or how much of the collection is metal items?
It's a relatively small proportion of the collection, because metal, especially in the Northeast with its acidic soils, metal is often decomposed by the time we find it. I mean, the shroud pins were preserved. We have some small things like metal spoons and other kinds of artifacts, but there's not a lot of metal, at least that I can remember.
And in particular with iron alloys, right? Those end up becoming lumpy piles of rust that we can use X-ray to determine what the object was before it decomposed, but we have to be judicious in what we choose to X-ray. But most of the metals that we have are copper alloys that would have been brass or bronze, as well as iron objects. But it's the preservation of those particular materials that we have many fewer metal objects. Textiles, similarly, organic materials, those are preserved through fire, as in the illustration of the gunny sacks that Nan shared, but also through waterlogged landfill deposits. So for example, we have leather shoes, other scraps of textiles that are preserved in the oxygen-free mud of these water-filled landfills. But all of those objects require conservation to arrest their continued decay. But glass and ceramics do make up the bulk of our collections because of their durability in New York City's acidic soils.
Thank you. Another question, is the archaeological collection used in the city to educate residents on the rich history of the city?
Well, yes, but I think in particular, I guess, Jessica, you should answer this one, because I know there have been some teaching collections formed of objects that the repository felt comfortable lending because sometimes they lacked provenience information or they had some other issues with them. But are those still going on?
Yes, we do. We do make collections available for teaching. One of our current initiatives is to develop curriculum that will tie into the New York City school system and use archaeological data as another way of learning about New York City's history. So we have a school district that we're going to be working with this summer as essentially a test pilot, and we'll be developing some of that curriculum. The website is the other primary way that we are making the collections available to the New York City, to the general public. And there are thousands of artifacts. We have hundreds of thousands of artifacts. And so this is a slow process, but as we are able to enroll new information about these collections, we keep pushing material out on our website. So that's an excellent question. And that's something that we hope to develop is resources for New York City teachers to draw upon. Our biggest, our primary collaborators at this moment are undergraduate and graduate students who are at institutions in the city. And we bring them in to teach them about archaeology, but also as a source for MA theses, PhD research, because there are many, many, many questions to ask and research and answer.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. Anything found at Inwood of interest, Native American, American Revolution?
I know there has been material recovered from Riverdale Park in the Bronx. I don't remember whether there's anything from Inwood. Do you?
Yeah, some of the late Victorian archaeologists that I referenced early on did excavations in Inwood, and those collections are at the New York Historical Society. So in terms of collections from Inwood, that we do not have any in our collection that come specifically from Inwood. But New York Historical and the American Museum of Natural History have artifacts that come from Inwood.
And those are mostly indigenous, right?
Yes, American Museum of Natural History have indigenous materials from that area, and the Historical Society has later colonial as well as some indigenous materials. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. How are findings now verified in the urban archaeological process? What role do oral histories play in your work?
Oral histories are not readily available unless they have been written down. There are, of course, indigenous oral histories that are really important to verifying interpretations made by, non-indigenous peoples as to what the function of indigenous materials is. But we don't have oral history for European traditions. I mean, we have some, European residents. We have some occasional things that have been written down, but I'm not sure how we would have access to oral history, to be honest. I mean, it's certainly a potentially valuable resource, and it's a very good question. But I don't know of much in the way of access to oral history.
Landmarks Preservation Commission recently landmarked a site on Staten Island called Archaeological, and it represents 8,000 years of indigenous history in New York City, and specifically in Staten Island. And as part of that process, the descendant nations were consulted about those sites, and the naming of that particular landmark came about in collaboration with the descendant communities. So that while that's not a direct oral history in the sense of telling an interpretation about a site or different events that happened at a site, that is an example of a collaboration where an indigenous name or deemed appropriate by the descendant community was decided upon.
Thank you. When new buildings are under construction, are artifacts found that have been buried under previous buildings on the site?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That's where when we did the first excavation in Lower Manhattan in the 1979 to 80 on the Stadthaus block, we had no idea whether there would be anything left in the ground, because we knew that each building lot had been built on maybe 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 times. So yes, there are artifacts beneath buildings. The trick is to have access to them, because there are only some buildings where if the building is what's called an as of right building, in which nobody needs to get any permission to do an excavation, then archaeologists don't have any way of accessing that material, even though it might be very important. But when there is an environmental quality review that's triggered by either the city, the state, or the federal government, then that's how we get to see what's there. But definitely there's lots of material below lots of buildings. And particularly important are 19th century buildings in, Manhattan, Queens, the Bronx, Staten Island, anywhere, because those don't have very deep basements. And so it's more likely, and many of them had backyard features such as privies or wells that are what we call artifact traps. People threw refuse into them when they're no longer in use. And so they're very good ways of gathering a collection of archaeological material if you find a backyard. Don't go dig it yourself, but it's certainly worth alerting somebody that you have a feature like that in your backyard.
One of the characteristics of urban archaeology is that cities build on top of themselves, particularly in areas like Manhattan and other boroughs of New York, where land is constrained by water. So you can't build out. So you must build up, where you get that layering of centuries on top of one another.
Well, this was an amazing discussion tonight, and thank you so much for your time. In the chat, I did put in a link for your book and for the repository in case anyone is interested in learning more. We will have a video available of tonight's discussion. And thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It was really an illuminating discussion.
Well,
So
thank you for asking us, and thank you all for attending and listening. We're very pleased to do that.
And I saw one question about oysters and what does a big oyster mean? And I will just follow up by saying sort of 8 to 10 inches. So these were massive oysters that actually had meat available for your oyster pies. So thank you all for this evening.
Right.
good night.
Good night. Take care. Mm-hmm.